Well, hello everybody, this is Miko from MO Sound Lab and this is Amped VX30. Let's check it out. Okay, and that is actually the guitar tone coming from the first preset on the first amp sim in this plugin without any tweaking done to it. So this plugin comes with two different VX30s, one from the 60s, as you can see, and one from the 90s, which is more fresh and modern looking and sounding. With both of these amplifiers, you have the option to use the bright channel, the normal channel, or the jumped mode, which is actually jumping both channels for ultimate gain and versatility. It's kind of a high gain channel with more low end, kind of like a plexi thing essentially, if you think about it. Now, just as important as the amplifier section is, we have the cabinet section that also features both of these VX30 amplifiers. So you have the Pulsonic cone IRs essentially from the 60s, and you have the more modern blue speakers from the early 90s. I personally love the early 90s VX30 speakers, so that's probably one of the best speakers of all time. Now, before we even get to any of the other features, I want to emphasize the importance of having the same person doing the impulse responses as the amplifier modeling section, especially in the case of the VX30, but this covers our entire amped range. Many times, if you didn't know, if some other person makes the impulse responses for the cabinet section, he may or she may live on another side of the planet and never actually be in contact with the amplifier. Now, the problem that comes with this is that the impedance of using this amplifier with a different cabinet is different. So if you're not using the same exact cabinet and the same exact amplifier, when making both the amplifier modeling and the cabinet modeling, you will not be getting 100% realistic results. And obviously this doesn't mean that it will sound bad if you don't do it, but realism, especially when it comes to the VX30, is super important. So this amplifier section here has been modeled while using the speaker cabinets of the combo, and likewise the cabinet section and these impulse responses that are being used here were done by shooting these impulse responses with the actual amplifiers that we're using here. So the results that we get are extremely realistic. That realism comes from the actual impedance curve that is being influenced by both the amplifier and the cabinet section. So depending on what kind of a combination of an amplifier and cabinet you have, this will sound very drastically different, and the difference will be in the actual brightness of the amplifier and also the low end thump of these amplifiers. Now, this is something that I can very easily demonstrate using the VX30. So if I crank the gain or the volume on the VX30, the kind of low end thump you get is very extremely realistic on this plugin. Let's have a listen. Now, if I was using some different IRs, if I was using something else for the load of the amplifier, I would have different results. So you may be asking, what is the difference between a 60s VX30 and a 90s VX30? Well, it's a big difference. I would say that the amplifiers are more similar than the speakers. Now, in the 60s, you actually had the Pulsonic cones on those amazing speakers, most sought after speakers. Even for greenbacks. In the early 90s, they were very true to the original circuit. It's actually one of my favorite VX30 amplifiers, and they used the blue speakers, which sound amazing. So I actually prefer the 90s one. But let's compare the amplifiers with the same mic up. This is the 90s VX30. And this is the 60s. So I would say that the 60s one has less gain, but more mids, kind of this Mojo vintage thing going on. Now, if we do the same comparison with the cabinet section, the difference will be much bigger. So if we are using the 90s VX30 and just using that 157 for this mic up, this is what it sounds like. Now let's use the same exact mic setup, but with the 60s VX30. So it definitely sounds more vintage, doesn't have that huge brightness in the top end, which the amplifiers do. So I would say the 60s one is actually more balanced right now, while the 90s one will be much brighter. Now, for those that are not familiar with using this amplifier in real life, I'll quickly go through the controls because there really isn't a lot to go through. You actually have a high cut. So this is kind of a reverse presence control. So if you turn it down, you actually get a brighter sound, and if you turn it up, it cuts the highs. It really doesn't start doing anything until you really crank it up. So I many times leave it at noon, and that's just fine. The bass control obviously controls the low end, which is somewhat similar what you can also do with the treble control. So personally, the way I use the real amplifiers as well as the plugin is I just use these two knobs. So I use the treble to control the brightness, and I use the volume to control the gain. And the volume control is very, very strong in this amplifier, and it's essentially a one knob amplifier in many cases. So let's just have a listen of what kind of versatility you can get out of this amplifier by just using the volume control. So this is probably the lowest gain setting that you can get, and let's just have the EQ section completely at noon. So this is the lowest gain setting you can get on the bright channel. So a very, very beautiful guitar sound that you can get, but even then it's not really 100% clean, and that is sort of the magic of the VX30. If you ask me, you have a very, very nice sparkle to the sound, and that is where the jangle and sparkle terms come from. That is actually the slight amount of distortion that you get with even the lower gain settings here. Now if we start to crank up the volume, this is probably where I would actually have the volume on my clean zones, and it definitely breaks up, especially if you pick hard. But it's just such a beautiful guitar tone, and you have a lot of dynamic range to use. So if you pick kind of lightly, you will get a kind of a clean guitar tone, and if you pick hard, it'll be harder. So let's try and demonstrate that. Very true to the real thing, as promised. Now, with the gain at noon, I actually don't ever have the gain at noon. I only use kind of this lower setting, or then I go past it. And once you start pushing this past the noon position, you start to get that low end thump and compression going on. It's not your modern high gain zone, just to be clear. Let's see what it sounds like, and I'll actually start to kind of push the treble up, because once you start using the gain, the low end gets flubby, then you need more brightness. So let's have a listen. So that's a pretty good guitar tone right there. So let's have a listen to something. Now, if you start pushing this volume all the way up, just realize that in real life it would be crazy. But let's do that and play some lead. So obviously you can pull off something like this. And you get the points. You get that sound out of the plugin, and you also get that sort of U2 kind of a... It's all in there, I promise. Now, this, as with all amp plugins, comes with a free trial, so go try it out for free. Comes with a tuner that is super reliable, a pedalboard with effects, a MIDI control for if you want to use this with a MIDI pedal. It just has everything in it. Thank you so much for watching the video, and please subscribe to the channel and go check out Amped VX30. I've been Mikko. Bye bye.